I'm going to replace the main bearings that ride in the case on the input shaft and the output shaft. So this is the input shaft. First thing we need to do is there's a snap ring on here that's got to go. So I already started this because it was being a bit fidgety. But that comes off like that. We're also going to need to take this snap ring off. That's really just used to locate it in the case. These are a lot easier to get off than the internal rings. Now I'm going to push this off. I have a 20-ton press. This is what they call a bearing splitter. So that can sit in there. And then you just snug these up. I've actually got a couple of pairs of these. You can get them. You can get OK ones from Harbor Freight, which actually I think this one is. This one's pretty easy to do, but some of them it's kind of hard to see now, but this edge is actually fairly thin, so some of them you have to get that edge into this notch, this edge here, to make them work. And for that, Harbor Freight one's not as good. I've got a proper one I bought from Napa Auto Parts, but this one was just laying on the press. I'm not going to bother to set up the camera, but basically the press has got two plates that are going to sit like this, and then a hydraulic ram down the top. It'll just push it out. It's pretty easy. Press the new bearing on. One thing you got to watch that between the gear and the bearing, there's a large flat washer which is labeled as an oil thrower, and there's a slight ridge on the gear side, so it's really easy. If you're not really careful about keeping that thing perfectly centered, this gear will go down and catch the gear, the spacer between that raised edge, and then your snap ring will be about 20 thousandths short of engaging. So it would be an easy thing to miss. So you just want to make sure that if you had a press where you could put it in like this and press it, it would be really easy, but I have to go that way on mine, so it falls off the boss. So you have to keep it really centered, and then, you know, a few thousandths at a time, make sure it's still moving, get it centered, and all of a sudden it's there and it's in. So it's fussy, it's a pain in the butt, not difficult. And then we need to put this back on as well. So this just fits in that notch. You want to make sure that its bearing goes with your groove on the pilot bearing side. The kits used to come with new one of these, but this one didn't. But anyway, there it is. It's in place. Just snaps in. So that's done. Now the next thing to do is going to be assemble the main gear set onto the input shaft. So it feeds from two directions. That, if you remember, there's the two-piece snap ring. That's this, and that goes into this notch. And it's the concavity of this gear set that holds it in place. These gears that go on this end just push up to it loose. And this is going to need a bearing as well, but you got to get the shaft into the transmission before you put the bearing on. So, as you remember, we took this apart and put it on this shaft. I, off camera, have replaced all 4 synchronizer cones with brand new ones. The only thing that's not on this shaft is the two-piece bearing, because it's kind of hard to have it, it won't sit there by itself. And I do have a new one here somewhere. There it is. So, I'm going to when I take these off, I like to stack them in the order that they're going to be going back onto the shaft. And that's that one. So the rest of this stuff goes on in the manner shown here. So this is the first 1-2 synchronizer, and that goes with the gear offset towards the input shaft. And then this is one of the new synchronizers, and there's 3 tangs on that. They go into 3 notches on there. Then a spacer. This is second gear. And another spacer. It's falling apart in my fingers here. Next comes third gear with its synchronizer cone. And right there. These are the new half clips. Go on there. So all these parts are still oily from taking the transmission apart. If you were building something that had been cleaned, you would want to pre-lubricate all this stuff to some degree. Alright, that's the 2-piece cone. This is the first gear and the first gear synchronizer. That's the spacer. And there's another circlip that goes in here. Well, I just went digging through the parts, and they did not send a new clip with the kit, and I'm disappointed in that. This one's new, this one's old, and if you can see, the gap here is about twice of what that is. So this is really what holds your transmission together. This is what breaks when people put 6 cylinders into Spitfire transmissions, by the way. So I really do not recommend reusing the original, particularly if you don't have whatever the special tool is. So this stacks on there. This is the last spacer, and if you'll notice, this has notches, so it only fits one way, and it's also hollow. So it goes flat face down, the recess face up. This goes over, and it's going to have to slide down this key shaft into the notch, which is down in the recess of that clip. So when you put this on here, you really want to try and not stretch this any more than is absolutely necessary, which is a real pain, but you know, you just kind of got to go with it. So I mean, I'm just using some small screwdrivers that'll fit in the notches, so I'm hopefully going to just slide that down. But there's a similar ring in the larger transmissions for TR2 through TR6. And I have the tool for that, but it is larger than this, so it won't fit on this transmission. So, I mean, it'd be really easy just to kind of wham this down, but you can see, you got to really try not to stretch this any more than you absolutely have to. I mean, I don't really think that this is a good way to hold a transmission together, and it's probably left over from, I mean, all these transmissions were upgrades from the pre-war transmissions. You know, and the pre-war transmissions got nowhere near the kind of power and abuse that these ones get. Because they were running with, you know, flathead engines, 25, 30 horsepower. This wasn't that big a deal. But they say this is for a GT6. And I think those engines, just stock U.S. federal smog spec, are 105 or 110 horse, which pre-war would have been, you know, a purpose-built race car. That was the technology, and unfortunately they really didn't have the money for development. That the war was not kind to any of the British car industries, because they were building airplanes and the Luftwaffe bombed the heck out of Coventry. So the standard Triumph factory was bombed into oblivion, not the Triumph factory, which is why Standard bought essentially their name after the war and became the Standard Triumph Motor Company. So, there we go. So just before you get to the notches, there's another little slightly raised section down here, which I can't see any real way to get over that other than a little very gentle persuasion. And that's it. It just closed up. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. And again, you got to keep all these gears together, or that two-piece spacer is going to fall out. But the gap is right here at the top, and if you look at that gap is closed up tighter than the used one is just sitting loose. And that's why you can't reuse these, because this would rattle around in there, and it needs to be just as tight as it can be. So, anyway. So that's that done. And then after that, we need to replace the bearings. This is the lay shaft. So it's got, this is like a little retaining ring that the inside of the lay shaft is hardened, and it's got loose bearings in there, which are these. Remember, we dug these out of the transmission when we took it apart. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take a little magnet and get the rest of these bearings out of here and make sure this is nice and clean. So this is the lay shaft cluster. I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is that interior bearing end, and this is all galled. This is why you need to pay attention to this stuff. This is a real weak point in these transmissions. So that's why it's taken a while to put this back together, because this one's no good. And I did find a new one, or at least a good used one, on eBay. It's this one. that smooth in there. So, we'll see if we can't get this transmission back together. Things need to go into the end of these counter shaft clusters here. So you put the retaining rings in. They just tap in lightly. Then you have to put grease in here, and then these are all individual bearings. You just go in one at a time, and you do is you go till it's full, absolutely full, and then you remove one, because you need a certain amount of space to breathe, to move around. If you fill it completely, it'll tear the bearings up in a couple of thousand miles, because there's just too much friction between the bearings themselves. So one of the difficulties with this modern roller bearings like this they come enclosed in a race and you just tap the whole thing but the problem is there's only about half as many bearings. I think there's like 13, I think was the most I could find, and this gets about 24. So the problem is, even with 24 bearings, it's easy to overload this thing if you start really banging the gears. So with a modern bearing, which would be a way to reuse that gear cluster, you could have turned it out so it would accept the bearings in the race, but it only has about half the capacity because there's so many fewer bearings, and they don't really make a solid filled one, unfortunately. So it's getting harder and harder to find these, because this is the piece that breaks on these transmissions. This is why so many people, there are kits now to put Ford 5-speed transmissions in, and on the big TRs there's conversions to put Toyota transmissions in. And I tell you, transmissions, modern transmissions are way stronger, better synchronizers, everything else than these transmissions. I mean, these transmissions, this one was built in the 70s, so it's almost 50 years old, and it's from a design which was really the pre-war design, which was a non-synchronized first, that they updated to an all-synchronous transmission. And of course they were designed for engines with a lot less horsepower, and they didn't get run like we do now. I mean, when these transmissions were designed in England, there were no highways, or freeways as we would think of them. So, I don't know how well you can see this, but there's the bearings in there, and if you look down at the bottom, there's just a little gap, and that's the space for that bearing. So here's the case. There's the counter gears in place. Don't forget there's the bushing bearing flat washer that goes on both ends. They fit into the notch, and then they stay up. The shaft goes down. Here's the reverse gear back in place. That shaft came in through that end, and then there's the pin that retains it. I think the main shaft will go in with that in place, but I just left it loose because I don't remember. It's been so long since I did this that it may have to pull that out to be able to get that shaft down and in. So that's ready for the counter shaft, but I do need to prep my bearings, which are these. This actually goes on loose onto that shaft, and after the shaft's in place you have to drive it on, which is a press fit here and there, so it's difficult. That's the input shaft. That bearing's on there already. So that was just held on with a, just pressed on, and then a snap ring held that together. But that'll go in after that, and there's also this little cage bearing goes into the end there, and that rides on there. So you gotta remember to, when you're getting ready to put this in, to put that in, put a little grease in to hold it in place while you're pushing it all together. So there's the main shaft in place. I was right that the reverse shaft could be in through with a plug-in. Here's my new bearing, but that's as far as it's going to push by fingers. Now it's going to be a matter of driving it on to the shaft and into the casing without losing the D-ring clips out of there, because these pieces will slide. So it's great fun. So I assembled the transmission, but I didn't turn the camera on, my mistake. So I thought I'd run over what we did. When we last left, had the bearing slid up the end of the tail shaft, and this was all loose. So from there, making sure I held this gear tight to this cluster so that the two split retaining ring didn't fall out. I used a copper mallet and just tapped the bearing so it was started on the large portion of the shaft so it would stay put. From there, I set up my press, and so I carried it over, making sure I held that bearing, that gear tight, and set the tail shaft through the press, and then lined it up so that the push point went through the hole in the end of the case and pushed on the end of the input shaft, all the while holding this bearing up, gear up. So from there, we pushed till that bearing bottoms out onto this gear when it's still about 1/4 of an inch out of the case. And again, you have to hold this gear up all the way, so I was holding up my fingers, and as that space got small, I put a screwdriver in there. So finally it was down to about 1/8 of an inch, and then I could just let it loose, because you got 1/8 of an inch, it won't fall out. About 3/16 and it will. So once that was in place, I supported the weight and just tapped the bearing the rest of the way home so it's flush like this one. So then this input shaft we'd already put together. So I inserted my little cage bearing into the end, made sure my synchronizer ring was still there. That just fit in from the end. Remember that the counter shaft gear is loose on the bottom, so you want to keep moving this to make sure it's not binding up, because even though it's loose, it can still bind up in the teeth here. And then just tapped it in with the copper hammer. It's it's a snug fit, but it's not real bad. So to just tap it lightly, working side to side, and it'll go in. Once I had all that in, then I flipped the transmission up on this end, which is why this table is so great with these slots. Means that the tail shaft could just fit down through the hole in the table. And then I lined up, this is the counter shaft, lined up this hole in that slot, and then I could take 2 screwdrivers and move the counter shaft into position. And you also have to line up these thrust washers as well, and they have to be really close to position because it's a tight fit. So once that's done, you can put the counter shaft in. Actually, counter shaft goes in from the other end. I think what I wound up doing is I put the old counter shaft in this way because it was easier, and then I just took the new counter shaft and pushed it back out. The counter shaft, you have to make sure you switch over. There's a little roll pin in the end which engages a slot in this adapter so that the counter shaft doesn't spin. So once that was in, could tighten up this, You make sure that there's a spacer goes on the back of the reverse gear here. It's about an inch long. I've got all that in, and that's where we are now. So from here, we're going to have to, I'll replace the seal in the bell housing. That'll get bolted onto the front with a gasket. Then we'll have to put the top cover on that has the shifter, and to do that, you need to move this synchronizer hub into the first gear position, and the big first, second fork in the cover into the first gear position, because like this, with this is the lever for reverse, you can't get that in when it's here, so it's got to be back here to get the clearance in. So we'll take pictures of that later. Alright, so we're getting ready to put the top cover back on. I've moved this back into first gear position, and I also want to make sure that the reverse lever is all the way forward, which is reverse unengaged. So to make sure it gets picked up in the cover when you lower it down. You can't really see that when you're going in, so you just gotta kind of do it by feel. So we'll get this camera set up, and then we'll lower the top on. Okay. So get the gasket on here, clean the surfaces up, all that good stuff. This is also in first gear. So you kind of get that one on first at an angle. You can see this in here. There we go. And that's good. It started. There's pins front and back. Get a couple of these screws started. This cover's not going to sit flat because there's one bolt in the back here that's trapped, and I haven't bothered to release it, so I got to wind this one down to be able to get the rest of them in. Anyway, we'll turn you back on after we got this all bolted down. So we've got the top cover all back on. After I got a couple of bolts started, I ran it through all the gears and reverse, making sure that everything worked, nothing bound up, all the levers were engaged. So all it's got left to do is put the bell housing on. If I can remember what I did with the bolts. Here we are. Put a new rear front main seal in right there. It's just a regular rubber seal. No big trick in that. And there's 5 bolts that hold this on. And then, other than snapping the clutch arm back in, it's ready to reinstall. Oh, I think that's going to do it. So that should do it for this video. So whatever my next project is, we'll film that too. Happy Christmas.